Here's chapter 1 of The Silence We Broke, written per your specs, followed by an automatic word count. Mummy, don't go, Ethan whispered, setting the toy stethoscope on Grace's chest where she rested on the rug. Daniel Whitmore stopped breathing. The rain battered the tall windows of the San Francisco mansion, a steady percussion that had underscored every lonely night for months, but now even that sound thinned to silence. In the spill of warm lamplight, the stethoscope's blue tubing looked like a ribbon laid across Grace's gray sweater. Just beyond the circle of warmth, the hallway's colder light chopped the room into halves gold and winter. At the seam between them stood Daniel, 48, hands still damp from a meeting that had lasted too long and solved nothing he cared about. Ethan's stuffed horse lay a few inches from Grace's shoulder, its one-splush mane rubbed flat by small, anxious fingers. The boy's bare toes curled against the rug, ready to fly or freeze. He didn't look at Daniel. He was all in the moment with her. The woman who mopped floors quietly and hummed like the house itself had a heartbeat. Don't go, he whispered again, softer, as if the words might startle and break like a soap bubble. Daniel's chest pinched. He had prayed for his son to speak, bargained with the air for one word, any word. Now here it was, 2.5 of them, and they weren't for him. Gratitude hit first, wild and bright. Jealousy trailed it like a shadow, petty and human. He hated that he felt it, and he hated that he couldn't stop feeling it. Grace did not stir. Her breathing was slow, the kind that comes when a body finally surrenders after a long day of invisible work. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. He knew that much. People like her never meant to. They collapsed only when the world wasn't watching. From the threshold, Daniel saw the shape of his life as if the rain had polished it clean. Boardrooms and headlines. A company that moved mountains for other families. And a home that could not move one scared boy 1 inch closer to him. He thought of the last months of 7 caretakers passing through these halls like weather, some burned out, some overwhelmed, some sent away by his temper because he couldn't bear to watch them try and fail. He had been decisive in meetings and disastrous in kitchens. He had stood outside Ethan's door at 2 in the morning, listening to unbroken quiet and fearing it would last forever. Ethan lifted the plastic chest piece and set it back exactly where it had been. Tiny hands, careful, ritual precise. The boy's face was open in a way Daniel had not seen in 2 years, not since the funeral that turned their house into a museum of her absence. He could still recite the order of that day by smell: lilies, rain, cologne, the salted metal temps of panic trapped behind his teeth. He had promised their child he would keep the light on. Then the light began to sting. Grace, he had been told, was a housekeeper. She kept a schedule, kept her voice low, kept to the edges. He had not asked for more than that. Yet, over the last week, Daniel noticed the smallest changes that made no announcement. A cup of warm milk placed near the doorway where Ethan liked to sit. A song hummed in the corridor that never resolved into melody, but smoothed the air anyway. Lights dimmed to amber rather than white. The scent of cleaner replaced by something like fresh rain. She did not reach for Ethan. She let rooms become gentle and waited for the boy to do the reaching now. His son's lips moved around a word that once meant the whole world. The sound slid beneath Daniel's ribs and found his old ache. He wanted to cross the rug, to kneel, to put his hand over his child's hand and feel the cold plastic and the warm skin and say, "I'm here." But he could taste the memory of every time he rushed it. Every time his need to fix overrode Ethan's need to feel safe. The boy's shoulders would hitch, the face would crumple, the room would fill with a sound that made Daniel want to rescue him and run from him in the same second. He stayed where he was. The good father inside him said, "Let it be." The frightened man answered, "For how long?" The rain thickened. The warm lamp hummed. Somewhere a clock clicked like a patient animal. Daniel's gaze fell to Grace's hands, palm up on the rug, a faint crescent of a scar peeking from her wrist. He knew almost nothing about her. He knew enough to suspect there were chapters shut tight. A fragment from HR, a mention of a hospital, pediatric care, a career that ended without ceremony. She had offered no story. He had not asked for one. These days, he distrusted stories. Stories made him believe he could control how they ended. He remembered the first time he heard Ethan's laugh, nothing grand, just a hiccup ballooning into a squeal when the boy was 2 and the dog chased Bubbles in the yard. He remembered how his wife would lift their son when the lights were too loud or the blender too sharp, and the boy would press his cheek to her collarbone and watch her breathe until the world decided to be manageable again. He had always told himself he would learn that trick. Then it became a secret he could no longer ask for. "Mummy," Ethan breathed, the stethoscope still. "Don't go." Grace's eyelids tremored, then stilled. She did not open her eyes. Daniel felt the moment strain like a cable. If he walked forward, he would take the whole thing down with him. If he walked away, he would betray what was left. Of the courage he had not spent, he eased his back against the doorframe and let the wood hold him up. In the glass, he caught his reflection silver at the temples, a good suit doing the work a heart should have done. He had never looked more like his press photos and less like a man. The hallway light cooled his shoulder. The living room pooled in warmth. In that line between, Daniel understood something that landed like truth. His son was not a problem to solve or an investor to reassure. Ethan needed a room where nothing hunted him, not even a father's hope. Grace had given him that without asking permission. Daniel had paid 1,000 experts to teach him this, and learned it in 5 seconds by standing still. He stayed still a little longer. He counted the boy's breaths. He let gratitude have the front seat, and when jealousy tugged at his sleeve, he told it the truth. You are not the point. From deeper in the house, a floorboard answered soft, precise. Daniel turned his head just as a figure paused at the far end of the gallery. Veronica Hale, her silhouette cut clean against the cooler light, posture impeccable, expression unreadable at a distance that still felt too close. For years she had been the voice in his ear for every decision that touched the company and eventually the house. Risk, reputation, return. She never mixed them up. Her gaze slid past Daniel toward the warm circle of the room, toward the sleeping woman and the boy with the stethoscope. Even from here, Daniel could tell she was taking inventory, not of tenderness, not of the miracle it was to hear a word, but of variables. He stood off the threshold suddenly, as if discovered. Veronica did not step closer. She inclined her head, a fraction, the kind of restrained acknowledgement that said, "We will speak about this." Rain stitched, the silence shut again. Daniel looked back at Ethan and Grace, the small blue hoop of plastic rising and falling with her breath. He pulled in air that felt heavier than it should have been and stepped backward into the cooler corridor, Hill finding the seam of marble and oak. He did not trust his voice to be quiet enough for what this moment needed. He did not trust Veronica to read what he was learning without trying to file it under something safer. He retreated into the hallway's blue light, pulse in his throat, and felt, without turning, the weight of Veronica's eyes following him into the dark. Word count. Check is below. Here's Chapter 2. Written to your specs and seamlessly linked from Chapter 1. I've included the automatic word count. Check below. Before the whisper before Ethan rested the toy stethoscope on her chest and asked the night not to take her there was the week. Grace Miller taught herself how to disappear inside the Whitmore mansion. January rain had a way of finding the bones of the house. It tapped the copper gutters, ran a cool finger along marble thresholds, gathered in the lips of the bay windows until everything wore a faint ocean-salted sheen. The place was immaculate in the way museums are immaculate. Polished wood, stone, that remembered other hands, art that asked you to hush. Even the HVAC carried a careful note, the low thrum of a system that thought it could keep weather and grief in their separate rooms. On her first morning, the head houseman outlined the rules with a clipboard and an apology in his eyes. Keep your voice low. Avoid sudden sounds. No strong cleaning scents. Mr. Whitmore prefers updates at the end of the day. The boy Ethan might be present. Do not engage. He paused on that last line, as if to say, not because we don't care, but because care has gone badly here. Grace nodded and signed where signatures were required. She parked her questions where she parked her coat, in a corner, easy to retrieve but out of the traffic of the day. She was 38, white, a woman who had learned the art of moving through rooms without stealing air. It wasn't something you put on a resume, it was something you earned by living through rooms that had taken too much. By noon she had mapped the house by breath. The library smelled of lemon oil and old paper. The north gallery held a colder light, the kind that exaggerated fingerprints. The kitchen was a cathedral of chrome that punished clatter. Every corridor had a secret echo. She kept time with those echoes, letting her steps fall into the quiet between them. She worked like a shadow. Wipe the banister, fold the linen, warm the towels in the small dryer because winter made everything stiff. Swap the harsh bleach for a gentler solution that still cut through grime but did not sting the nose. She measured out the hum that calmed her most anxious pediatric patients years ago and mixed it into the day. The low, wordless line of a lullaby she never finished, never took into full melody. If anyone asked, she would have said she hummed. For herself, nobody asked. The mansion held history in a glass case, and with it, the history of people who couldn't stay. 7 caretakers in a month, the houseman had muttered when he thought she couldn't hear. 7, and no blame to any of them. Some left shaking, some were let go. Progress reports had been typed and filed. Schedules had been built like bridges to nowhere. Grace had seen that pattern before in clinics with waiting rooms packed tight with hope. In families who had forgotten how to breathe around one another. She learned the Whitmore rhythm, Daniel leaving in a press of phone calls, returning in a cloud that smelled faintly of rain and coffee, staff deferring to the pace of his strides, the house tilting toward performance whenever he entered a room. He was polite, even kind in a formal way, but impatience bled through the seams. He liked dashboards and metrics. He wanted the graph to point somewhere quickly. America loves a turnaround story, she thought, then tucked the thought back where it belonged. This wasn't a case study. This was a child. On the second day, the scent of citrus polish overpowered the kitchen. Grace cracked a window and watched her breath white. Against the pane, a cup of warm milk sat cooling on the counter, a habit someone kept out of obligation rather than hope. He never drinks it, the cook said, not unkindly, as she slid a tray of vegetables into the oven. We still try. Grace listened the way old training makes you listen to the words and to the places where words don't reach. She did not pick up the cup. She kept sweeping until the cook's attention shifted, then poured a fresh serving into a smaller tumbler, the kind that fit a child's hand. Warmed it just short of hot, tested a drop on her wrist, slid the cup to the floor near the threshold, where the hallway narrowed into a familiar outer corner with a view of the kitchen without the commitment of entering it. She did not look toward the hall. She wiped the counter, she hummed, she left. On the third day, Daniel stood in the doorway and asked, "How is he doing with you around?" The question was a test and a plea. Grace recognized both the management voice and the father under it. She kept folding the towels she had warmed, hands steady. "I'm working on the house," she said. "Houses can be loud even when nobody talks." He frowned, not at her tone but at its refusal to promise. The world he lived in paid handsomely for guarantees. She had none to sell. That night she took stock the way nurses take stock, not of numbers, but of patterns. Ethan drifted through rooms like weather, but he paused in the same two places, the landing halfway up the north stairs, and the length of velvet curtain that framed the living room window. Both spots offered cover with a line of sight. She set about lowering the volume of those spaces, the creak that wanted oil, the light that needed a softer bulb, the cleaner that could surrender its perfume for something that told the nose, "You're safe." She remembered the pediatric wing soundtrack, the clack of chart wheels, the interruptive chime of monitors, the shoes that squeaked when someone ran. She remembered the day all of it had been turned against her in a room with wood-paneled walls and rows of chairs that smelled like old arguments. She had lost more than a job there. She had lost her right to narrate what she knew. Since then she had practiced the discipline of being unimpressive. Let the work be the only thing that speaks, she told herself when the urge to explain rose like a flaring match. On the fourth morning, she found a scuff mark at Ethan's height along the baseboard outside the pantry rubbed into a crescent by small feet pivoting on anxious heels. She knelt with a damp cloth and worked until the wood remembered its original color. When she stood, she left the little tumbler of milk 2 feet away, where a hand could find it without finding her dot in the afternoon. Daniel paced the length of the great room with a phone pressed to his ear, eyebrows set in the expression of a man whose entire life had been built by moving fast. "We need results," he said to someone who was not there. In the kitchen, Grace switched the dishwasher to the quiet cycle and shut a cabinet door with a fingertip instead of a palm. When Daniel ended the call, he watched the steam curl up from a pot and missed the glass of the stovetop hood. "What exactly is the plan?" he asked, voice low, impatience braided tightly with worry. "Keep the air soft," she said. "Make spaces he can leave without feeling chased. Let him notice me instead of the other way around." "That's not a plan," he said. "It's the only kind that's ever worked for me." He looked like a man who hated and understood the answer at the same time. Then he nodded once and left her with the hum of the refrigerator and the clock that refused to hurry. By evening the rain had returned with a new intention, drumming on the skylight over the back hall as if to remind the house it stood on Earth, not in a magazine. Grace moved room to room, dimming lights as the sky dimmed, the way she had in the hospital to help night arrive without an argument. She placed a second small cup near the living room curtain and went to polish the brass on the banister. Working in patient circles, she told herself she would not check. She told herself that checking was a noise of its own. She finished the banister. She wiped the new prints that formed while she worked. She cleaned the sink, rinsed the cloth, folded it edge to edge and laid it flat to dry. Only then did she return to the threshold of the living room, not stepping over it, just leaning into the warm spill of light. The first cup of milk was half empty. Grace didn't smile. She didn't move. She let the room hold the moment the way you hold a sleeping child, with a stillness that says, I see you, and I won't make this heavier than it needs to be. Second week of January 2023. The rain had softened into a mist that the mansion's eaves combed into threads. Grace moved through the rooms with a cart and a wordless tune that lived somewhere behind her teeth. It wasn't a song so much as a temperature low, steady, and warm enough to tell a startled animal that the field was safe. She paused at the bay window to rub a crescent from the glass. In its reflection she caught a small shape standing not behind the curtain this time but beside it. Hands down, shoulders unhitched. He stared at her without the flinch that used to come first. Grace kept the cloth moving and let her breath make the rhythm. The air carried the faint scent of soap and damp wool. The lamp wore its soft shade like a hush dot. She did not speak. The rules said don't engage, and the calmer part of her agreed. She knew the difference between an invitation and a cornering, between a child who could approach and a child who would be chased by someone's good intentions. She let the distance stay kind. In the afternoon she lowered the bulbs in the north gallery and oiled the hinge that worried the silence. Ethan followed at the span of 3 lampposts close enough to watch, far enough to leave. When the broom rasped across the rug edge, he turned his face, listening with his whole body. Grace adjusted her grip, eased the bristles, and the sound went from scratch to cloud. She remembered the clinic's sensory room, the bins of textured squares, the way some children would trace one felt star for 10 minutes until their shoulders settled. She had believed then in small, faithful things. She believed now, but quietly, as if her belief might spook the moment. A cup cooled near the living room threshold, not the big porcelain mug from the first days, but the small tumbler that fit better in a small hand. Grace had set it where a person could reach without stepping into the open. She passed it as if it belonged to the baseboard and not to Hope. On the stairs landing, a cleaner line had dried into a dull film. She knelt and buffed it back to shine. From the angle of the baseboard she could see small scuffs in a half-moon, a map of anxious feet pivoting and pausing. She wanted, just for a second, to smooth the mark with her palm and tell the wood it wasn't its fault. Instead, she breathed and worked. In the evening she found Daniel in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, posture tight as if bracing the counter with his forearms. He gestured to the row of printed schedules a consultant had mailed over and didn't look at them. How long does this take? He asked. Before we know it's going somewhere, however long it takes for a room to stop being a threat, she said, rinsing the cloth. She kept her tone low. It will move faster than it looks. He tried to smile. It came out as a compromise. The country had taught him to count days by metrics, and she could feel him trying to translate patience into a chart with arrows. He nodded and left before his disappointment had a chance to turn into pressure. Grace wiped the last circle from the counter and stood still long enough to hear her own heart. The quiet in this house wasn't peace yet. It was waiting. She understood waiting. There had been months when she'd practiced it like a profession, waiting for a hearing, for a letter, for a judge to remember that a mother is still a mother. Even when a room is full of doubt, a flash of a hallway from years ago came and went, the blur of her daughter, ponytail crooked, backpack too big, turning once to look back over her shoulder with a face that asked a question Grace didn't know how to answer. She kept the image on its leash and returned to now. This house had its own child to answer. Daniel stood at the threshold of the living room later that night because he didn't know where else to put his body. The lamplight sat on the rug like a pool, gold and forgiving. From his place in the cooler hall he could see Grace cross the far side, gather a nest of blocks into a basket, and set the basket down without making the blocks talk. No cheerful running commentary, no invitation pitched like a challenge. She was doing the smallest work as if it were a ceremony. He noticed details now, the way she never stepped between Ethan and an exit, how she avoided the rug fringe that made the vacuum sing, how she arranged the room so every path had a second path beside it. The competence irritated him for reasons that sounded noble and weren't. He was grateful, yes. He was also of a job he thought he was supposed to do alone. Ethan entered the edge of the lamp's Grace and stood 3 child lengths from Grace. Daniel watched the muscles in the boy's jaw as they set and released. The stuffed horse dangled from 2 fingers he could remember, with the ache of a fresh bruise. The first time his son clung to that toy after the funeral, when the house smelled of lilies and rain, when every door sounded like it shut something. Living out. Grace moved to the sofa and sat on the edge as if the cushion might spook. Her palms turned up on her thighs, a posture that said both I'm here and I won't take. The hum returned. the small ribbon of sound that kept its head down. Ethan took one step closer, then stopped, eyes on her mouth as if he could see the tune like a line of light. Daniel pressed his shoulders into the doorframe so he wouldn't move. The need to intervene rode up his spine. Say something, teach something, win something back. He could feel the habit of a lifetime, the meeting voice, the commanding fix rise to the back of his teeth. He tasted it and swallowed it. Ethan knelt in the lamp's pool and set the horse down carefully. He looked at Grace's hands. He reached into the pocket of his sweater and brought out the plastic stethoscope. Blue tubing looped into a shio. He held it, considering. Daniel counted to 10 because 10 was a number that had saved him from mistakes before. Grace didn't count. She breathed out. The boy leaned forward and placed the chest piece on Grace's sweater, right where the fabric lifted and fell. The disc glinted once like a coin. He adjusted it the way he did with his toys when alignment mattered fraction by fraction until it felt right. Then he bent, brought his ear to the other end, and listened. Grace did not look at him. She looked at the middle distance where people look when they are remembering not to weep. The hum faded into a kind of reverence. "I will heal you, Mummy," Ethan whispered. The sentence landed in Daniel so hard his knees unlocked. He found the wall with his palm. It was an absurd sentence, wrong to the fact of things, and it was the truest thing he'd heard in years. He wanted to laugh, and he wanted to beg, and he wanted, more than anything, to be the one those words were for. Jealousy came a small, mean animal that knew his name, and then it did a strange thing. It lay down. He watched his son's face, loose, present, unafraid, and understood that the point was not who received the sentence. The point was that Ethan had found a sentence at all. Grace's hands trembled and then steadied. "I'm here," she said so softly it might have been to the room. The old reflex to explain the resume he would never read, the hearings, the letters pressed at her ribcage and passed. She offered no story. She offered her breathing and her stillness. Daniel let the scene live its full length. He felt the architecture of his certainty shift by degrees. Quiet empathy had outperformed every expert. The graph he wanted was right here, in a chest rising, in a child leaning in. From the far end of the corridor, a footfall measured itself into the quiet. Daniel lifted his head. Veronica Hale's silhouette paused in the cooler light, as precise as an exclamation with the sound turned off. Her gaze flicked to the lamp's circle, to the woman and the boy, then to Daniel, who had nothing on his face he wanted her to see. He stepped out of the doorway and met her halfway, voice low enough to keep the room whole. "Run the full background check," he said. The words careful, the man underneath them not. "Everything we can pull tonight." Veronica's brows tipped in the smallest question, then flattened into compliance. Daniel felt the sentence hang in the air between them like a paper he might sign in regret. Behind him, the hum silenced into the sound of breathing, the map of a new country just beginning to be drawn. Late January 2023, the storm had lifted, but Daniel Whitmore's head carried its own weather. He sat in his study long past midnight, rainwater still streaking the glass as if the sky refused to release the house. His laptop hummed against the silence. On the screen, a series of documents Veronica had sent, with the clinical neatness of someone confident in the weight of paper. Grace Miller was not Grace Miller. Veronica had traced the line backward: hospital rosters, court transcripts, an employment file that ended in words he hated: negligence, unfit, custody revoked. The child she had lost was a daughter, aged 4 at the time. His stomach turned, as if the text were a physical substance. He could almost hear the gavel strike through the walls. The quiet house he had entrusted to her suddenly felt like a stage with props nailed into place. He scrolled down further, a line underlined by Veronica's cursor: incident with a pediatric patient. Disciplinary hearing led to termination. Beneath it, a scan of a judge's ruling. Veronica had highlighted 3 phrases: lack of professional judgment, unstable behavior, loss of parental rights. Daniel leaned back, pressing his palms to his temples until color sparked behind his eyes. He had told himself she was a housekeeper, nothing more. Now the word housekeeper was a mask pulled from a deeper face. He thought of Ethan whispering "Mummy" and "I will heal you," words meant for her. They sounded different now in memory, like evidence tampered with. The next morning he found her in the laundry room, folding towels with the slow patience of someone who understood fabric mattered. The hum of the machine covered the hesitation in his throat. "Grace," he said. His voice surprised him, hoarse, businesslike. "I know who you are." She did not look startled. She smoothed the towel edge before answering. "Then you know enough to make your choice." "I can't risk my son." He hated the sound of the sentence, even as it left him, like a contract written in panic. "Not with your history, not with what I've seen in those files." Grace placed the towel on the stack and turned, her face steady in the fluorescent light. Ask Ethan if I'm dangerous. The simplicity disarmed him. No denial, no pleading, just that. He felt the words land heavier than any document, but the papers waited upstairs, whispering liability, headlines, disaster. Veronica found him later in the boardroom of his company's downtown tower. The table was a runway of glass. The city shimmered below. She looked every inch the counselor. She had made herself into 50 black, once from a neighborhood that forgot its children. Now the voice investors trusted when Daniel faltered. You've built too much to gamble on sentiment, she said, her tone equal parts mentor and prosecutor. One scandal and you won't only lose custody of your company, you could lose custody of your son. He stared at the skyline. The lights stitched the dark like promises, numbers that meant profit, metrics that obeyed pressure. Here, outcomes were predictable. If you pressed, things moved. Home did not work that way. His son did not move by force. Grace had taught him that, though she never claimed to. Her record is not conjecture. Veronica continued, it's the law. You of all people should respect precedent. She slid a folder toward him, as if a board decision were waiting to be signed. Don't mistake your gratitude for judgment. Her words struck because they touched the fracture already there. Gratitude for Grace, for what she had done with Ethan, warred with the caution that ruled every other sphere of his life. He had once watched shareholders turn on a CEO for less than a rumor. Here he was, contemplating trust against evidence. He heard his wife's voice, in memory gentle, singing Ethan to sleep, the exact opposite of a headline. He remembered promising her at the hospital that he would keep Ethan safe. He had defined safe in contracts and safeguards, but grief was a courtroom in itself, and doubt its judge. Daniel carried both in his chest. That evening he asked Grace to step into the kitchen. She arrived with her sleeves rolled, flour dust still on her hands from helping the cook. He wanted to see guilt or deception. Instead he saw fatigue carried quietly, like a backpack she refused to put down. He told her, in clipped tones, that her employment could not continue. The words hung in the room like smoke. She nodded once, no tremor in her chin. I understand. Ethan appeared in the hallway, clutching the stuffed horse, eyes wide as if the house itself had shouted. Grace glanced at him, then back at Daniel, and raised one hand in the faintest wave. No explanation, no story, just a farewell that said more than any defense. When the door closed behind her, the silence in the mansion felt heavier than before she had arrived. Daniel stood in the cold marble of the foyer, his throat raw. Upstairs, a boy's voice rose, not words this time, but a cry stripped of language. Daniel pressed his hand to the banister, the wood solid, his resolve less so. He had followed the file, the law, the precedent, and yet the house already knew it had lost something. It needed. In the corridor, Veronica's heels clicked once, twice, pausing behind him. You did the right thing, she said. He couldn't tell if it was comfort or control. Either way, it sounded like judgment. February 2023 arrived like a light bulb, too bright for the room. The morning after Grace left, the house tried to remember its old routine and failed. Daniel Whitmore stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, with a bowl of oatmeal cooling in his hands and a promise he didn't know how to keep. Buddy, he said, voice kept low the way Dr. Collins had taught him months ago. Just a spoon. Ethan sat on the rug, the stuffed horse balled under his chin. He did not look up. When Daniel moved closer, the boy's body braced, shoulders up, hands flexed, breath held. Daniel stopped and set the bowl on the floor beside the door. The smell of cinnamon filled the air. A minute passed. Then two. Ethan rocked once, twice, as if counting the seconds with his spine. By noon, the oatmeal had a skin, and Ethan had not eaten at all. The pattern repeated at lunch. At dinner he lay curled in the corner beside the window and whispered to the glass, "Mummy," the word unraveling into a sound that was both prayer and protest. The house, unused to the noise of grief, echoed it back. The staff tried. Minna, the afternoon housekeeper, set out crackers in small, predictable rows. Mr. Chen adjusted the dimmers so the hallway light stayed at amber. In the kitchen, Usher Patel warmed milk to the exact temperature Grace used, testing a drop on her wrist, then slid it near the threshold. Ethan ignored it all. When Daniel stepped into the living room and sat on the floor at a cautious distance, the boy covered his ears and pressed his forehead to the carpet. "Mummy," he said again, the second time a shiver rather than a word. That night, Daniel called Dr. Collins. She arrived the next morning with a canvas tote and a calm that didn't feel performative. Dr. Maya Collins was 40, a Latina therapist, With field-worn wisdom in her eyes and tennis shoes that didn't squeak on marble, she set her bag down like someone placing a lantern. "Tell me the last 24 hours, she said, stepping into the quieter corner of the room with Daniel. He gave her the facts and the ache between the facts. He's refusing food. He can't settle. He keeps saying. Daniel stopped, because the word opened a door he couldn't close. Dr. Collins nodded, listening with her whole face. "Regression after a rupture is common," she said, "especially for a kid whose nervous system reads the world on high. Right now, Ethan's not choosing to refuse you. His body is refusing everything." She glanced at the lamp, the blinds, the echo in the room. When nervous systems flood, the first intervention is not language, it's environment. She walked the space the way Grace had, making small adjustments that felt like respect rather than control, lowering the blinds a third of the way, swapping the bulb for a softer one, moving the speaker that sometimes hissed when the HVAC kicked on. From her tote she produced a pair of padded headphones and a modest lap blanket with a gentle weight. "Offer, don't insist," she said. "Remove demands. Think exits, not corners." Daniel nodded, swallowing the part of him that needed to fix everything with speed. "What about," he gestured, toward the kitchen. The Chart A consultant had sent the pile of toys he had bought after midnight, as if plastic could bridge a void. "All this. Keep the routine skeleton," Dr. Collins said, "but strip it to comfort. Fewer sounds, slower transitions, predictable light. Let him watch you do tasks without asking him to join, and eat in the same chair at the same time, whether he joins or not. He needs signs that the world still behaves." She looked at him as if to be sure he'd hear the part beneath the instructions. "And you're allowed to feel awful. It just can't drive." He laughed once, dry. "It's been driving since January." They tried. The headphones dulled the refrigerator's hum and the dog across the street. The blanket became a presence, not a restraint. Daniel stood at the counter and made a sandwich, narrating in a low monotone only the steps he couldn't hide. A pen spread, fold, then ate half while facing the same direction Ethan faced. He set the other half on a small plate near the doorway. The boy didn't look, but his shoulders stopped climbing toward his ears. Dr. Collins returned 3 times that week. Each visit a calibration rather than a verdict. "Less is more," she repeated. "When he can't meet the world, shrink the world." She taught Daniel how to time his own breathing to keep from crowding the room with urgency. She showed him how to end a moment before it broke. Leave the toy a foot away. Leave the door open. Leave the light, the color of patience. None of it fixed the central fact. Ethan wanted grace. Each night his voice found the same word, and each night Daniel wrote the same 2 sentences in the black journal he kept under the living room lamp. "I sent away the only person who made him feel safe. I don't know how to forgive myself on Thursday." Dr. Collins sat with Daniel at the kitchen table while Usha chopped vegetables in a rhythm that sounded like someone keeping time for hearts that had forgotten how. "I'm not asking you to bring her back today," Dr. Collins said carefully. "I am asking you to notice what changed when she came, not magic conditions." "She hummed," Daniel said. It sounded small to his own ears. "That's not small," Dr. Collins said. "It's a cue. They're all cues." She pointed to the lamp's shade, the curtain pooling on the floor, the small tumbler on the counter. Quiet, amber, reachable. Your son read them as safety. Daniel thought of the boardroom where he had spent his morning, a place of glass and clean lines and no mercy for slowness. He thought of Veronica's file on the table like a sealed verdict. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I did the responsible thing," he said. But the sentence didn't land anywhere solid. "Responsibility without context can look a lot like fear," Dr. Collins said, and left it there by Friday. Ethan managed 3 bites of toast and sipped water from the middle of a straw as if avoiding the first and last inches made the world less sharp. It felt like victory until an afternoon Noizan automatic hand dryer in the downstairs bath roared to life when Mr. Chen tested it. Ethan crumpled where he stood, palms, 2 ears, mouth open but soundless for a long second that broke Daniel's spine. Then the scream came. Daniel moved, then stopped himself, then moved again with the headphones. And something like a plan, soften, shelter, shrink. The scream thinned, then broke apart into hiccups. Daniel sat on the floor a yard away and counted 5 slow breaths in, 5 slow breaths out, like a lighthouse. That night, alone in his study, Daniel opened the journal and wrote. He ate toast. He survived the dryer. I heard him breathe again between cries. Maybe that counts for something. He left a space and added, I don't know how to give him back what I took. He closed the book and stared at the shelves that had been decorated by people who preferred symmetry to story. The children's books kept from earlier years, more out of duty than used, leaned in a tidy row, their spines bright with a cheerfulness the room did not deserve. He reached for one at random to keep from thinking and felt it stick slightly, as if the shelf itself had a secret. Behind the books sat a yellowed envelope, edges softened by time, dust sealing it shut. No stamp, no address, just a label in black ink. Ethan, initial EVAL. Daniel turned it over in his hands. The dust coated his fingers, then his throat. He hesitated, then broke the seal. Mid-February 2023, Grace was rinsing a coffee cup in the mansion's back kitchen when Daniel's voice found her low, stripped of its boardroom edge. "I need your help," he said. "For Ethan, I was wrong." The cup clicked once against porcelain. Grace set it down. She did not ask for details. The house had been giving her the headline all week. The way silence had sharpened at the edges, the way the staff moved as if holding their breath. "Tell me where we're going," she said. "Burlington," he answered. "Then a short drive. Dr. Joseph Lang," he added, as if confessing. "There's an old evaluation." She nodded. The smallest doors in her chest cracked open. "I'll pack what he needs," she said. "Soft headphones, lap weight, snacks he can accept." She almost added, "I'll bring the hum," as if it was something you could fold and zip. They took the afternoon flight east. At the gate, Grace sat with Ethan on the carpet near the window where the planes backed out like careful whales. She kept her bag open so he could see the picture schedule she'd sketched in pencil. Airplane, car, house with trees. The boy traced the aeroplane with one finger and pressed his cheek to her shoulder as the boarding call braided with announcements from other gates. Daniel stood a few feet away, guarding space rather than trying to fill it, learning the new job of not pushing. On board, Grace asked the attendant for a quiet row and a cup of ice. She helped Ethan settle the soft headphones over his ears and tucked the small lap blanket across his thighs like a whisper. When the engines rose, Ethan tensed. Grace leaned so that her shoulder touched his, not to pin him but to give him a steady coastline. She hummed, low, lower than the engine itself, a note that had kept more children company than she could count. By the time the plane leveled, the boy's spine uncoiled a fraction and his fingers softened around the stuffed horse's mane. From the aisle seat, Daniel watched the two of them from a distance measured in inches and years. He took out his phone, opened his notes app, typed, then deleted. "Thank you for getting on this plane when you had every reason not to." He put the phone away. Some words didn't want to scream. They landed to air that smelled like clean cold. The rental car was a sensible sedan with seats that didn't creak. Grace sat in back with Ethan, arraying familiar things within reach. The stuffed horse, a silicone straw for water, a small bag of plain crackers. Outside, Vermont held winter in long strokes, bare maples, fields pressed flat, the sky a thoughtful gray. Daniel drove as if speed could spook the road. They made the first hour without incident. Then at a rest stop, a patch of asphalt with picnic tables and a bathroom whose dryer barked like whether something loud rolled through the lot. A truck's engine grinding into idle. Ethan folded in on himself so fast the world blurred. He slid under the nearest picnic table, palms to ears, the stuffed horse pressed to his mouth. His breath came in panes of glass that wouldn't open. Daniel took one step too fast and stopped. Hands lifted as if surrendering to the child and to his own helplessness. Grace went to her knees. She didn't say his name. She crawled under the table and let the wood frame their small shelter, the smell of cold and damp cedar gathering around them. She arranged her body so her ribs aligned with his and eased the lap blanket over his legs. Then she placed her hand lightly on his back, no pushing. Just wait, like the fact of Earthan began to hum. The sound barely qualified as sound. It threaded the space between the engine and the wind and the blood in their ears. Ethan's shoulders shuddered. She waited. 10 seconds, 20. The truck idled louder, then softened, then finally moved off. Under the table, the boy's breath stumbled, then found an old rhythm. He turned his face so that his forehead touched the hem of her coat. Grace let the moment end by itself. When she felt the muscles in his back stop bracing, she whispered, "We're okay." From his crouch, Daniel watched the scene as if it were happening behind glass. He tried to count his own breaths, and failed. When they emerged, Grace did not stand immediately. She sat back on her heels so that Ethan could decide where his body went next. After a minute he slid out, stood up, and looked toward the rental car as if the world might still be safe enough to continue. They drove the last miles with the radio off. The clinic sat just off a 2-lane road, a white building with a green roof tucked among pines. It did not look like a place where verdicts were handed down. Inside, the waiting room had lamps instead of overheads, puzzles instead of televisions, and a rug that felt like a field. A bell chimed once when the door opened, then knew how to be quiet. Dr. Lang came out to greet them himself. He was 68, lean with careful hands and hair gone all to silver. His eyes held the steadiness of someone who had practiced honesty, longer than most people practiced their crafts. His accent placed him somewhere across the Pacific. His handshake placed him in the exact present. "I remember Ethan," he said simply, as if remembering were an act of care. He did not rush the appointment. He watched the boy move through the room. Watched the way Ethan's gaze found the corner first, and then the shelf with the wooden blocks. Watched how he chose the blue ones and lined them like small lakes. Dr. Lang spoke to Daniel about the last months and to Grace about the last week, but he did not speak to Ethan until Ethan stepped into the space of his voice on his own. When he did, Dr. Lang only said, "You're doing a good job noticing." After an hour, the doctor set his pen down. "This is not a picture of disconnection," he said. "This is a picture of overwhelm." He shifted one lamp a fraction, as if to illustrate. "Your son's system takes in the world unfiltered. Light, sound, touch, they arrive at full volume. He protects himself the only way he can, by narrowing, and trust enters. The world narrows less." He looked between Daniel and Grace. "That's why the room changes him. Not because of magic, because of sense." Grace felt something loosen, not relief exactly, but the dignity of being allowed to understand. "What about the earlier evaluation?" she asked. "You said you remember him." Dr. Lang nodded toward the folder on his desk, manila and worn. He slid out a copy stamped with a date from years ago. "I wrote it then," he said. "Sensory processing disorder, not a fixed sentence approach." He tapped the page with a practiced finger. "I sent it through the channels I was given." His thumb paused over a carbon copy notation at the bottom. "Forwarded to V. Hale." The room tilted a degree. Grace felt cold move up her arms, the way it does when a memory fits its cutout too cleanly. Veronica, the name, had followed her through closed doors and beige hallways. She reached for the page and didn't. Daniel leaned in and did, eyes narrowing as if the font itself were an accusation. "I never saw this," he said. "I wondered why you didn't follow up." Dr. Lang answered. "No accusation in it, only the sadness of familiar patterns. Sometimes reports are misplaced when they don't serve a plan already in motion." Grace found her voice steady even as the floor felt less so. "It wasn't lost," she said, more to the room than to the men. "Someone made sure it was." She felt the old fear rise, the one that kept her small for years, and watched it crest and pass. The lens of this moment sharpened into a purpose that didn't ask permission. Dr. Lang slid copies into a new envelope and wrote the date by hand. He handed it to Daniel, then another to Grace. "Second chances," he said, as if naming the ethic that held the walls up. "For parents, for practitioners, for the child most of all." They stepped back into the Vermont dusk with their breath fogging the air. The pines held the light a little longer than the road did. In the car, Ethan touched the corner of Grace's envelope as if it were a texture worth learning. She placed it in her lap, the weight of paper familiar and changed. Daniel buckled in and stared at the copy in his hands. The letters, V. Hale, bright as new frost. Grace looked at the road unspooling toward darkness, and then at the boy reflected. In the window, headphones slack around his neck, eyes calm in the way calm happens after a storm. The second twist of the story landed. Not like shock, but like a key in a long-locked door. There had never been a lost report only, a report someone decided to lose. Grace closed her fingers around the envelope until the cardboard gave a little, and for the first time in years, she did not lower her eyes from the future. March 2023, back in San Francisco. The mansion's windows looked out on a city that refused to pause. Cable cars rattled, fog drifted off the bay, and headlines did what they had always done, move faster than truth. The first email pinged Daniel's inbox on a Monday morning. By noon, there were half a dozen more. By evening, every outlet that covered wealth and scandal had picked up the same story. Disgraced woman back in Billionaire's house custody case. The articles were laced with grainy courtroom footage of Grace years younger, her voice raised, her face streaked with tears. The captions carried words like unfit and unstable. By Tuesday morning, the knock came. 2 representatives from Child Protective Services, polite but firm, stood in the foyer. Their clipboards carried authority that money couldn't bend. "This is procedural, Mr. Whitmore," the lead officer said. "We've received multiple reports expressing concern about Ethan's safety. We need to verify conditions in the home." Daniel stood tall, nodded, and let them in. His chest burned. Not from anger at the officials, they were doing their job, but from the knowledge of who had orchestrated this. Veronica's fingerprints were all over it. Ethan stayed in his room during the inspection. Headphones on, Grace sitting on the floor beside him, humming under her breath. The officers walked through each hallway, examined the locks, the lighting, the medications kept in the upstairs cabinet. They asked Daniel about routines, interventions, safety measures. He answered carefully, knowing every word was a line in a transcript. When they left, assuring him the inquiry would be ongoing, Daniel walked into his study and closed the door with more force than he intended. His hands trembled as he reached for the journal. He wrote only one line: "She will not take my son through paper lies." That evening, Grace knocked softly and stepped inside, holding her phone as if it were fragile glass. "There's something I never showed anyone," she said. She pressed play. The voicemail was short, but venom dripped through every syllable. "You speak, and I'll ruin you again." Veronica's voice, unmistakable, sharpened by the hiss of an old recorder. Grace's eyes did not waver as the sound filled the study. Daniel sat back, blood rushing to his temples. "Why didn't you give this to the court years ago?" "I was afraid no one would believe me," she said quietly. "And when they didn't, I lost my daughter. Fear taught me to keep it locked away. But Ethan doesn't need my fear. He needs truth." Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her courage settling in his chest. This wasn't a weapon. It was testimony. And testimony belonged not to gossip or strategy, but to the law. The next weeks became a different kind of work. Daniel called not investigators from the tabloids, not private enforcers, but lawyers who valued process more than profit. He opened files he had ignored, requested transcripts through the proper channels, asked for copies of every evaluation Ethan had ever received. Each request was logged, stamped, signed, no shortcuts. The mansion became a hub of quiet resistance. Mina, the housekeeper, gathered clippings of articles and noted patterns of phrasing. Usher, the cook, passed along a contact whose nephew had once been threatened by Veronica in a clinic setting. Mr. Chen, meticulous with his routines, recalled a family who had left the practice after disagreements about medication and gave Daniel a name. Daniel met them, one by one, parents who sat across from him in coffee shops, their voices low but steady. A mother described how her son was labeled autistic despite tests showing sensory issues. The label brought insurance coverage, but not progress. A father spoke of pressure to medicate, threats of custody review when he resisted. A nurse whispered how she had been fired after questioning Veronica's directives, then handed Daniel a photocopy of a report with dates that didn't align. Each testimony was written down, notarized, preserved. Daniel kept a folder locked in a fireproof box. But what mattered more was the way these people looked at him, not as a billionaire, not as a boardroom strategist, but as a father fighting for truth. One evening, after Ethan had finally fallen, asleep with his headphones slack around his neck, Daniel sat on the study floor, surrounded by files and testimonies. Grace joined him, cross-legged, the voicemail phone between them like a small, potent relic. "She buried Dr. Lang's report," Grace said, voice steady. "She buried families. She buried me." Daniel touched the edge of the envelope Dr. Lang had handed him in Vermont, its corners now soft from handling. "And now she's trying to bury Ethan." Grace looked at him, the fatigue in her eyes lit by something fiercer than resignation. "So what are you going to do?" He thought of every boardroom where he had played defense with precision. Words, controlled narratives, outcomes dictated by leverage. But here, leverage had to be earned in daylight, not shadows. If Ethan was to have a voice, Daniel would need to model one. He looked at the stack of testimonies, the notarized statements, the voicemail file waiting for chain of custody submission. The ethical path was longer, slower, but it was the only one that would hold. "I'm going to confront the system," he said. The words left his mouth like a verdict, binding not only him but the family he was trying to protect. From the hallway the house creaked. Upstairs, Ethan shifted in his sleep, and in the silence Daniel felt both the terror and the resolve of a man who had finally chosen his side. April 2023. The federal building's glass walls reflected a sky too bright for what the day carried inside. The sign outside read Ethics Review Board, Pediatric Practices. Inside the hall smelled of paper, carpet, glue, and nerves. Daniel adjusted his tie for the third time as he sat at the long table, papers neatly stacked in front of him. He wasn't here as CEO, he was here as a father. The weight felt heavier. To his left, Grace sat with her attorney, her face calm in the way a shoreline looks calm after storms because waves have already broken there. She touched the edge of the table once, grounding herself, then folded her hands. The hearing officer, a gray-haired woman with a clear voice, began. This proceeding is convened to review allegations of misconduct, professional fraud, and endangerment related to past diagnoses and practices. The respondent, Ms. Veronica Hale, will be afforded equal opportunity to present evidence. Veronica sat across the aisle, her suit perfectly pressed, her smile calculated. She gave Daniel a small nod, the kind of nod one gives a peer in a boardroom. He didn't return it. For the first time in months, he felt no debt to her advice, no trust in her judgment, only resolve. Daniel's POV witnesses were called. One by one, parents stepped forward, voices sometimes shaking but words steady. A mother described being pressured into medication plans that left her son sedated but no better. A father recounted threats that his custody would be challenged if he questioned the autism label. A nurse explained how evaluations were edited before submission dates shifted. Test results narrowed. Each testimony pressed on Daniel's chest like a weight but also lifted him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a chorus of voices that should have been heard years ago. Grace's old voicemail was introduced into the record. The court clerk pressed play. The hiss, then Veronica's unmistakable voice. You speak, and I'll ruin you again. The words filled the room, flat and undeniable. Daniel felt the air shifters leaning forward, pens pausing. Truth had a sound, and it wasn't rehearsed. Grace's POV when the board asked her to speak. Grace rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. She didn't bring papers. She brought memory. I was a nurse once, she said, her voice carrying more steadiness than she expected. I believed children deserved someone to stay, even when they couldn't respond. I lost that job after a child's evaluation was rewritten without my knowledge. When I questioned it, I was discredited. When I raised my voice in court, I was called unstable and I lost my daughter. She inhaled. The hearing room blurred for a moment, replaced by flashbacks, her little girl's drawing folded into her purse. The echo of a gavel, the silence of supervised visits that never came. She blinked, and the present returned. I cannot rewrite that part of my life, but I can tell you this. Ethan Whitmore spoke for the first time in years when no one was testing him. He spoke because he felt safe. Her words fell into the room, like stones into water. The ripples reached every table. Daniel's POV Veronica's attorney rose. He produced a thick folder, claimed it contained proof of Grace's instability and evidence the evaluations had been correctly handled. But as pages were examined, inconsistencies bled through. Dates that didn't match court records. Signatures, copied inexactly. Metadata analysis revealed documents modified months after the supposed evaluations. The officer raised a brow. Ms. Hale, can you explain why these records show alterations inconsistent with chain of custody protocol? Veronica's lips parted, but the polished answers she had always carried deserted her. She stammered, redirected, then fell silent. The sound of silence was louder than her defense. Grace's POV. She watched Veronica falter and felt a complicated ache. This was the woman who had once controlled her future with a sentence, who had buried Dr. Lang's evaluation, who had taught fear to be her language. But now, in this room, truth peeled the power away. Grace did not feel triumph. She felt release. Dr. Lang testified last. His voice was calm, his words exact. He confirmed his original evaluation. Ethan's struggles aligned with sensory processing disorder, not classic autism. The difference matters, he told the board, because treatment paths matter. Labels shape futures. Grace exhaled for the first time in weeks. Daniel's POV. The verdict came after a recess that stretched like a year. The hearing officer returned, papers in hand, voice clear. On the matter of professional conduct, Veronica Hale is found guilty of fraud, falsification of records, and unethical interference in patient care. Recommendations for revocation of licenses and further criminal review will be forwarded. The officer turned a page. On the matter of Ethan Whitmore's care, the board accepts Dr. Lang's original evaluation. The diagnosis will be updated to reflect sensory processing disorder. Intervention will be guided accordingly. Daniel closed his eyes. His son's future had been realigned in one sentence. But the officer wasn't done. In response to Child Protective Services inquiry, Grace Miller is permitted to return to the Whitmore residence under supervised conditions pending review. This reflects both her past and her present, with the understanding that continued oversight ensures stability. The gavel struck lightly. The hearing adjourned. Grace's POV. She felt Daniel's eyes on her but didn't look back right away. Her hands trembled under the table. Supervised return was not full restoration, but it was breath after drowning. She whispered to herself. Second chances are still chances. As they walked out into the spring light, the reporters gathered like crows, questions flying. Grace shielded her face with one hand, not from shame but from exhaustion. Daniel stepped slightly in front of her, not as a billionaire shielding a scandal, but as a father shielding the woman his son trusted. She heard him exhale, the kind of exhale that sounded like a decision forming. Cliffhanger ending inside his chest. Daniel knew the truth was only half won. Veronica's downfall was justice, but the system that had enabled her still stood. As he guided Grace through the cameras, he thought, I will not stop at saving Ethan. I will confront the entire system that let this happen. The spring air felt like a summons. May 2023 arrived with softer mornings. For the first time in months, the Whitmore mansion didn't echo with silence or screaming it breathed. Curtains no longer stayed permanently drawn. Lamps glowed in amber shades Daniel had finally agreed to replace. Rugs and beanbags had been added to corners where Ethan liked to retreat. The house itself seemed to stretch, learning to welcome sound again. Grace kept a slim notebook she called the Progress Journal. Each morning, after tidying the kitchen or folding laundry, she wrote one small victory, however fragile. May 2nd. Finished half a slice of toast without hiding under the table. May 6th. He tapped the piano keys twice, then laughed when one squeaked. May 11th. He put the stethoscope on Daniel's chest only for a second. But it counts. Grace wrote these notes in steady script, not to decorate hope, but to anchor it. The biggest change wasn't the house, it was Ethan. He no longer hid from every sound. The weighted blanket became his friend. He even tolerated Daniel reading aloud in the evenings, his father's voice softer than it had ever been. And though the word mummy still slipped out when he clung to Grace's arm, it was joined by new words whispered but present. One morning, Ethan carried the stethoscope to the garden. Grace followed quietly, watching him place it against a rose stem, waiting as if nature might whisper back. When the boy lifted the plastic earpieces, his smile was small but alive. Daniel, standing at the kitchen door, whispered, "He's listening differently." Grace only nodded. Words weren't needed to describe what they both saw. 2 weeks into May, another sound entered the house. The shy knock of a boy named Leo. Grace's breath caught when she first saw him. 9 years old, with hair a shade darker than hers and a skin that bore the mixed tone of his father's heritage. Leo held a sketchbook to his chest like armor. His foster guardian introduced him formally, but Leo hardly looked up, his wide eyes flickering between Grace and the floorboards. Daniel had arranged the meeting cautiously, supervised, with CPS's approval. For weeks, Grace had prepared herself, telling her heart not to expect too much. Still, when Leo murmured hi, she felt a tear threaten. Ethan stood behind her, holding the stuffed horse. He stared at Leo, then at the sketchbook. Slowly, he stepped forward, stethoscope dangling from his hand. Without words, he offered it. Leo hesitated, then reached out. He placed the toy earpieces against his own head, pressed the bell against his sketchbook, and smiled faintly when no sound came. Ethan's giggle broke into the room like light through shutters. Grace wrote that night, May 18th. Ethan shared the stethoscope. Leo smiled. The house made room for 2 boys. Life became a rhythm of careful routines. Ethan ate his meals with Leo sketching beside him at the table. Sometimes Leo drew horses, sometimes houses. Ethan would touch the paper, then trace the lines. In the air with his finger, no one forced conversation. The bond grew in silences and small gestures. Daniel watched often, standing back. One evening, Grace found him in the doorway, arms crossed, expression softened. "I used to think control was the same as care," he admitted. "But presence is different." Grace smiled, touched by the honesty. Presence leaves room for them to grow. The mansion shifted, laughter hesitant at first, then fuller became part of its soundscape. Mina the housekeeper left crayons on the counter instead of stacking them away. Asha baked cookies shaped like stars, encouraging the boys to press cutters into the dough. Even Mr. Chen, precise as ever, added a basketball hoop near the garage, explaining it was for balance. Grace added each moment to her journal. May 20th. Ethan clapped once after Leo's drawing of the horse. May 23rd. Both boys hummed the lullaby while I folded laundry. May 26th. Daniel put his phone down during dinner and listened. Near the end of May, a cream-colored envelope arrived by courier. The seal bore the crest of the Walters Foundation for Ethical Pediatric Care. Daniel opened it in the living room while Grace sat with the boys on the rug. He read silently, then looked up. "It's a gala," he said. "Next month." They want us to host, announce new programs, families, donors, the press. His voice carried the weight of decision. Grace's chest tightened. A gala meant lights, cameras, attentions, the very things Ethan feared, the very stage she had once stumbled from in disgrace. Yet it also meant visibility, resources. Change. Ethan pressed the stethoscope against Leo's chest, listening to the quiet thump of pretend. Leo laughed. Grace caught Daniel's eyes. Between them, the unspoken question settled. Could their fragile new world survive the glare of public light? The letter trembled in Daniel's hand, and so May ended not with silence, but with a house filled by laughter and a summons to the next trial waiting just beyond the door. June 2024. The ballroom lights shimmered like captured constellations. The Walters Foundation Gala had drawn hundreds of parents, doctors, advocates, donors, all gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to honor a mission born from fracture. Backstage, Grace smoothed Ethan's jacket. He wore a tiny navy blazer, sleeves a bit too long, and his faithful stethoscope around his neck. He tapped it twice against his chest like a secret knob. Leo stood nearby, clutching his sketchbook, doodling a horse with careful strokes. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, but his attention stayed fixed on the boys. A year had passed since Vermont, but it felt like several lifetimes. He still carried guilt like a scar, but tonight, he felt something rare, anticipation, not of deals or speeches, but of his son's voice. The host finished introductions, applause echoing. Then a spotlight drifted toward the stage. Grace's breath caught. Ethan took a small step forward, then looked back. She bent to meet his eyes. "You can do this," she whispered. "I'll be right here," he nodded, gripping her hand until the last possible moment before walking alone into the light. The microphone waited. Silence stretched. The ballroom of polished adults leaned in. Ethan lifted the stethoscope, pressed it once against his chest, then raised his gaze toward the audience's voice, soft but clear, carried across the room. "This is my mummy. She healed me." He paused, glanced at Grace, and smiled. "Now I heal her." The air shifted. Tears rose. Applause began but hushed itself. Then Ethan added, with sudden certainty, "And Daddy helps, too." The room broke open gasps, then laughter through tears, applause swelling until it became something larger than celebration. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. Daniel's vision blurred. For the first time in years, he let his son's words enter without fear of what they meant. Grace stepped onto the stage, gathered Ethan into her arms. Daniel joined, wrapping both in an embrace that didn't feel staged, didn't feel like survival, felt whole. Cameras clicked, but for the three of them, the night belonged only to touch, to laughter, to the miracle of words spoken at the right time. Later, when the crowd thinned, they returned to the mansion. Shoes were kicked off, ties loosened, gowns hung carefully. The kitchen told a different story. Cereal bowls stacked, crayons scattered, flour dusted across the counter from Leo's attempt at cookies. Earlier. Grace sat at the table with her progress journal open to the last page. She wrote, slowly, June 2024, "Ethan spoke for all of us." The house laughed with him. Leo showed Daniel his latest sketch, a family drawn with pencil, uneven lines but steady hands. 3 figures stood beneath the roof, 2 boys in the middle, a woman with a wide smile, a man with his arm around her. At the bottom, Leo had written, "Home." Daniel folded the drawing into his wallet, his throat too tight for words. The months that followed carried momentum outward. The foundation's outreach grew from one office in San Francisco to clinics across 3 states. Families traveled to hear that misdiagnosis was not destiny, that overwhelm could be met with patience, that children deserved someone who would stay. Grace became the face of compassion without pretense, visiting waiting rooms with her humming voice, reminding parents they were not broken for needing help. Daniel took the podiums he once despised, speaking not of profits but of choices, how trust could not be outsourced, how community meant refusing silence. He spoke honestly about his failures, and audiences listened because vulnerability sounded different than wealth. Ethan's picture hung in every clinic lobby, not a posed photo, but a candid shot of him pressing the stethoscope to Grace's chest. Below it, the foundation's motto, "Listening is the first healing." Leo, once shy, now ran through the mansion's halls with his brother. Their laughter turned the echo of cold marble into something warm, alive, and ordinary. One evening, nearly a year after the gala, Grace stood at the kitchen sink, watching dusk paint the bay outside. The house behind her buzzed, Ethan giggling as Leo tried to balance blocks into a leaning tower. Daniel reading aloud even when no one listened. Grace, closed her eyes for a moment and let the sound soak through her bones. For so long she had feared silence, the kind that took children and futures away. Now she knew silence could be broken, not with noise, but with presence, with forgiveness, with community refusing to look away. She dried her hands, returned to the table, and joined them no longer as housekeeper, not even just as mother, but as part of a family still learning, still laughing, still healing. The world outside would always carry storms, but inside these walls there was laughter enough to outlast them. And as she tucked Ethan in that night, he whispered again his words, soft but steady, like a promise remembered. "Mummy, Daddy helps, too." Grace smiled through tears, brushed his hair back, and whispered back, "Yes, he does. And so do you." The house fell quiet, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was a silence filled with hope.